Hey kiddos, so today we are starting to talk about sectionalism. In the last chapter, we talked about the era of good feelings and the early market revolution and the kind of the economic and political things that are going on in the country. Today, more specifically, we are looking at society as a whole, and we're taking parts of the early market revolution and the kind of the division that's starting within the Democratic Republican Party, and we're talking about regionally the differences that are starting to develop and how that affects society. So we will talk about economic differences and political differences, but how that is shaping a northern society, a southern society, and a western society, and how they're going to kind of interact. We're covering from about 1820 all the way up to 1860. So you'll start to see the development of sectionalism as it is going to impact or lead to a civil war over the issue of slavery. And you'll see that today in particular, how slavery as an economic institution becomes a political issue that will kind of help to kind of create this divide between the North and the South. Okay, so let's start out in the North. Two regions we're going to talk about today within the North. You have the industrial Northeast. So think about like along the Atlantic seaboard, kind of part of those original 13 states. And then we're going to talk about the Old Northwest, which is like the Northwest Territory, land that was won with the Revolutionary War, as westward expansion is kind of taking place because of some of those policies that we talked about during the era of good feelings. So the American system, for example, people are starting to move west. So the industrial Northeast is going to be really benefit from the early market revolution. The North is the most populated section of the country due to a high birth rate. In addition to that, high immigration during these years. There's a lot of push factors in Europe, which we'll get to in a second. And at the same time, Americans are, because of the market revolution and because of the difficulties within the farming communities, economic panics, there might be times where American farmers have to kind of give up on that American dream of owning land and becoming a successful farmer and have to kind of move into cities and work for wages. And so that will also play a role in that. So market revolution really is limited to kind of textiles in the early years. By 1830, though, farming equipment, shoes, clocks, weapons, anything and everything that you can kind of think about for this period of time, you're starting to see it being mass produced. Workers do start to organize unions and local political parties that attempt to use like collective bargaining and strikes in order to improve those conditions. Conditions are low pay, long hours, unsafe working conditions. There's some success in Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Supreme Court and Commonwealth v. Hunt said that, yes, you can have peaceful unions that do peaceful protests in order to negotiate with business owners. And that was good, and it was a good precedent. However, not a lot of progress during these years for unions. A couple of reasons. One, economic depressions or panics, as we will call them. And what that does is basically people aren't, they're just trying to put food on their table. So they don't really have the, I don't want to say privilege, but like it was a luxury, right? To be able to say like, no, like we're going to sacrifice, income to like get higher wages. That just really wasn't possible at that point in time. The courts and businesses were very hostile towards unions, meaning that they wouldn't hire you or they tried different negotiations. The courts would strike things down. You'd be fired. And then there was also just, and this is probably the biggest one, an abundant supply of cheap immigrant labor. If you're not willing to work the hours that the business wants you to work or the factory wants you to work, if you don't like the wages, they have immigrants that are more than willing to take those jobs for you. So a continuity throughout the 19th century in labor union wise is that they were not very productive. Even in the Industrial Revolution, like after the Civil War, they really struggle. It's not until the progressive era in the 20th century where unions start to make a little bit of progress. So urban population is going to grow from about 5% of the population in 1800. So 95% of Americans were kind of rural or rural farmers. By 1815, it's about 15%. So keep in mind, we are still the majority of Americans are kind of in rural areas and agrarian, but it's still a large jump. And so with that, and this is just in the North, by the way, okay? With that, slums do start to expand. You have crowded housing, poor sanitation, diseases. Crime is going to be an issue, and this is something that you'll kind of see. But what's interesting is it's going to continue to, you're going to see, even like after 1850, more and more people are going to move from rural farms into the cities, and immigrants from Europe are going to stay in these cities versus moving out to the West. So that is something interesting, that despite how the negatives of these cities at the time, people are still moving into them. Okay, 250,000 African Americans are living in the North during this time period between 1820 and 1860. Only 1% of Northerners, though, total 50% of all are free. Okay. Freedom meant that they could have a family and like get married. In some cases, they could own land. Not a lot of states prohibited that from happening. Just because you were a free Black did not mean that you had political, social, or economic equality. They were discriminated against. There were laws in most states that prevented them from voting, having certain types of jobs that kind of limited it to skilled professions, laborers in most cases, like masons and things like that, or like just manual labor. A lot of like domestic help, so butlers and cooks and things like that. New immigrants displaced a lot of free Blacks from a lot of jobs that they had held since the Revolution. And African Americans were banned from joining labor unions. They would be hired to break up strikes, but as soon as a negotiation between the union and the factory came to like a conclusion, they would most time be fired. One of the occupations in particular that I think that's really interesting that was kind of integrated right from the time of the Revolution on is that African Americans and whites in the whaling industry. And that was a job that African Americans did, and it was one of the ones that when like poor Irish immigrants came over, that they typically were replaced. So that's a good example of an industry in which they were replaced by immigrants. Okay, in the Northwest, relatively new territory, the frontier at first, and Americans are moving in to that area now that Native Americans have been removed. So if you think about the first few units that we talked about, with military campaigns that drove out Native tribes, if you think about Little Turtle and you think about Tecumseh, the War of 1812, that was kind of detrimental for Native American tribes east of the Mississippi River. Really after that, most Native American groups have been pushed west of the Mississippi River. They're also building canals and railroads, which is connecting, which we talked in the last unit, or in the last chapter, where like the Erie Canal has connected the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Lakes. So people can move into that Northwest territory, farm, grow a cash crop of corn or wheat, get it on a steamboat, and then they have kind of expanded their markets. At the same time, Americans are in the Northwest territories like Indiana and Ohio, now have access to mass-produced consumer goods from those northern cities, right? So we talked about how the farmers are feeding the cities and the people in the cities are making mass-produced goods to sell to those farmers in rural areas. In particular, during these years, kind of the 1830s through the 1860s, farmers in the Northwest Territory in particular are really going to benefit from John Deere's steel plow, Cyrus McCormick, and the mechanical reaper. So these agricultural products that help farmers and farm families become more efficient. So efficiency means that it saves you time. Time equals money. So you can kind of think about they were willing to invest in the steel plow. So most of the time, and we talked about this a little bit too, is like why the panic of 1819 really hurt farmers is that they would take out a loan on this new steel plow or a reaper. So a reaper is how you harvest. You think of the Grim Reaper, right? So manually they would cut wheat and things like that. A mechanical reaper is something that you would pull behind your oxen or your, livestock or whatever it is that you had, that would help you kind of like almost like automated. It's not automatic, right? Like it's not like a tractor or anything like that. We're not quite there yet, but it does help these farmers become more productive and more efficient. And so they take out loans, like they buy more land, they buy this equipment. And so when there's a depression or a panic, now they're in debt even more. The prices of crops are dropping. And so they really did have a difficult time. Financially, farmers will always have a difficult time, but the temptation of taking out more loans to pay for these this equipment to be more efficient. They're trying to attain that American dream, but they're having a really difficult time. So in the Northwest Territory, because of these canals, because of transportation, these small villages that are popping up along the Great Lakes, like Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, they are now going to kind of become these huge cities eventually. And it's because that's where they would take their trade centers. That's where they're going to take their crops to sell. Same thing along the Mississippi River. So like St. Louis, eventually Memphis. And then that'll kind of connect into New Orleans. That's when we get a little bit further south, though. So in 1820, you have about 8,000 immigrants that came into the country that year. By 1854, there was a record 428,000 immigrants that came into the country that year. And it's going to kind of go up and down. However, between 1830 and 1860, there are no less than 50,000 immigrants per year. So 4 million immigrants total from Northern Europe are coming to America and during this antebellum time period, looking for a new life. A lot of it does have to do with push factors, right? So whether it be famine or war, but there's also pull factors, kind of this idea of more economic opportunity, the idea of like owning land, because remember, that's not really something that's quite attainable for peasants in Europe. It's more affordable to accomplish as well. So especially as technology is increasing with steamboat technology, you can kind of get there a little bit cheaper, especially like cheap one-way tickets. They are coming into cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Some of them remain. It kind of depends on your the home country and like who do you know and where and what information and what resources do you have when you get there. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But some do spread into the Northwest, especially like Scandinavian populations. They avoid the South. And this is very important in understanding the political division between when we think about slave states and free states. They are avoiding the South completely. Not many immigrants. I mean, granted, there are going to be some that might go into Charleston or Savannah, kind of within those cities, but they do not see as much economic opportunity in southern states as they do in northern states and kind of like in the West. And so they avoid that completely. Immigrants are going to strengthen the economy during these years because, one, it's inexpensive labor. They are coming from utter poverty in Europe, and so they'll kind of work for anything. And an increased demand for consumer goods. So they're not only producing goods in these factories at cheap labor, but they are also consuming the goods that are purchased. And that's very important in understanding immigration policy over the years. It's kind of why we've always had this open, kind of like open doors policy towards immigration, is because they typically benefited our economy historically. It's really not until like the 1970s, 1980s, where it was kind of a drastic change. A lot of that has to do with perceptions and other issues. There are times of like depression when they were not really as well accepted. And so that's just a little bit different, but mostly from an economic standpoint. Now, xenophobia within the people has always existed, but immigrants are good for business. And so that's something to kind of remember when we're thinking politically. So where socially people disliked immigrants and discriminated against immigrants, economically and business interest-wise, which then influences the politicians, that's a little bit different, okay? So Irish immigrants, about 2 million Irish immigrants, so about like half of all the immigrants that came during this time period, came from Ireland. Most of them are tenant farmers. They were pushed out by the famine in Ireland. They were strongly discriminated against because of their Roman Catholic faith. They were in competition for African Americans' jobs and unskilled and domestic help. And they typically congregated in cities like Boston and New York. Many of them will join the Democratic Party once we get to that. So just kind of keep that in mind. The Germans were a little bit different. So where the Irish were kind of seen as unskilled and this really big nuisance, and they came over with a lot of people. So that also made it easy to kind of discriminate against them. Germans, a little bit more modest, much more skilled artisans and workers, but they were not looking to congregate in cities as much. They really moved out into the fertile farmland. They were looking to own land and to kind of spread out. Strong supporters of public education. Many of them were against slavery, and so that's going to play a role politically. And so because of this large number of immigrants that are coming in, you do have the birth of this like nativism. Even though xenophobia is something that has existed since the Alien and Sedition Acts, political parties are going to be created during these years that their entire goal is to limit immigration. Like it's a political movement. You have the Supreme Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. It's going to kind of play more of a role in local and state politics, and then on a national level, the Know Nothing Party will be a national party. And I know that that's a silly name, but we'll talk about them eventually. But the Civil War, right, there are other issues leading, up into the 1840s and 1850s that are going to kind of dominate that besides immigration. So that party's not going to be very strong. There are multiple issues that we're going to talk about over the next couple of chapters that are big issues that a lot of people are going to talk about. However, the slavery, the political division, the sectionalism, and leading up to the Civil War is going to kind of dominate politics. So that was the North. Moving into the South, agriculture is the foundation of Southern economy. Now we're shifting from tobacco, rice, sugar cane, kind of the 17th and 18th centuries, but now in the 19th century is going to be cotton. On the last chapter, we talked about the cotton gin and the impact that that had on the economy and on the institution of slavery. And remember that the North is getting wealthy off of Southern cotton and Southern slavery as well. So you had textile mills in England, which was a high demand, in addition to the textile factories that are fueling the Northern economy, okay? So cotton is now affordable. Cotton cloth is affordable worldwide, and there's a huge demand for it, especially with consumerism, right? It's not that you just have one dress or one set of pants that you wear like every day for a year or 2 years or 5 years, and then you get another one. Now people are starting to purchase, like have more than one dress to wear, more than one suit to wear. And so cotton is, because it's affordable, which makes people want more, right? If you think about your closet today, right, you always want more clothes. That's kind of the beginning of all of this because it's so affordable. You can just go to Target or go to Walmart and buy something and you just keep stacking it in your closet. This is kind of the beginning of that. Originally, cotton is grown chiefly in two main states, so South Carolina and Georgia. But as they are removing Native Americans, as the demand grows and increases, and as Southerners are basically profiting more and have more capital to spend, so capital meaning money, they are investing that capital in land in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, very fertile soil. Remember that, land in South Carolina and Virginia and Georgia has been cultivated for generations now. And so the soil is depleted of some of the nutrients. And so when you're looking at Alabama and Mississippi, it was perfect to grow cotton as a cash crop. By 1860, cotton is going to provide 2/3 of all U.S. exports. So when they say cotton is king, Like, it is what drove the American economy. When we think of American capitalism, you cannot ignore the fact the plantation system, the institution of slavery, played a major role in American capitalism in the 19th century. So how do you justify it, right? So we've talked about the economic part. Wealth in the South is determined by land and slaves, bottom line. And they were traded and sold as livestock. They were property. And so Southerners try to kind of explain this. And so you have a couple different views. At first, you kind of have this, well, it's a necessary evil, like it's kind of an economic justification. But over time, throughout the 19th century, what you start to, especially as they start getting more defensive about it, especially after the Missouri Compromise, is John C. Calhoun from South Carolina calls it a peculiar institution, to where they start to defend it with historical and religious justifications. We'll talk with the Second Great Awakening that's happening during this time, where they start to convert slaves and really use it as a justification. They start to find examples in the Bible to justify it. You can see this political cartoon kind of behind me, or a piece of propaganda, really. They're saying like, well, there's the Negro in his own country and then the Negro here in America, as if it's very paternalistic. Like they need to be thankful that we're taking care of them and that we're giving them food and work to do each day. And, we're putting a roof over their head, that they should be grateful that they wouldn't be able to have this if it weren't for us. Biblically, that they are inferior. And slaves were not educated because due to rebellion. And again, we'll talk more about that when we talk about the abolition movement and religion as well. So what's interesting, though, is I think a lot of students have this misconception that all Southerners owned slaves, and that's just not true. It was actually a minority of Southern whites owned slaves. So in 1831, you're going to notice that as you get closer to the war, it drastically changes. But by 1860, only about 25% of Southerners owned slaves. Southern whites owned slaves. And of that, when you think about large plantations with, hundreds of slaves and 1,000 acres, it's even smaller than that. Most whites that owned slaves owned 20 or less. They worked side by side with their slaves on plantations. Economically, slavery really didn't benefit many Southerners. So Hinton Rowan Helper is a North Carolinian, actually. He wrote The Impending Crisis of the South. Now, remember North Carolina's history with slavery, not a huge slave-owning population. That takes root with the Outer Banks and the lack of trade, the ability to ship tobacco in those early colonial years. And so instead you kind of have more small self-sufficient farmers. That's the majority of Southerners. They are small self-sufficient farmers. They might own a couple of slaves, but really they had to compete with these large, so think about the Walmart versus the mom and pop stores in capitalism today. And so economically, slavery really didn't help many Southerners. And one of the main reasons is kind of that hoping that they could one day attain that planter status where they themselves could own slaves. And that was kind of all the plan in all of it, is kind of dangle it in front of poor white Southerners to think that, oh, well, you can attain this one day. That's the American dream. And so they supported it. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next couple of slides. So the cotton boom is responsible for the increase of slaves. Obviously, it's going to jump from about 1 million to 4 million by the time of the Civil War. The Deep South, slaves made up as much as 75% of the total population. So, that can be kind of dangerous position for white planters. And so they needed to try and prevent slave revolts. So legislators passed laws that restricted the movement of slaves, the education of slaves. These are called slave codes. They'll be very similar to things that we see with the Black Codes and Jim Crow laws all the way up through the 1960s. 1960s, yes. For work, you can either labor in the fields. Many of them did learn certain crafts, especially if they were in urban areas. But even on a plantation, they are self-sufficient. So not only are they growing hundreds of acres of cotton, but they also have fields for corn, livestock. They would have a blacksmith, they would have a carpenter, and the slaves would fill those positions, or the enslaved people would fill those positions. House servants, they worked in factories, construction. If you've ever heard of like a chain gang, that's going to be used later for like after abolition, after the 13th Amendment, where they do like manual labor in that regard, but they'll be used for construction during this time as well. Because of the price, many slaves in the upper South were sold down South. And that's something that we see in a lot of like slave narratives, is they talked about the fear of being sold down South or down the Mississippi, because you're further away from, especially when you think about the Underground Railroad and things like that, the further south you get, the more harsh the conditions were as well. So by 1860, the price of enslaved people was as high as like $2,000. I mean, it's the equivalent to like a nice car today. Typically, the higher the price for young men, like late teenage years, early 20s, they want them to be able to, be strong and be very athletic looking, but also, they're thinking of them also as they want them to reproduce. They want them to have families. And because that is free money, right? Those children then belong to the owner. In addition to that, the families were used in order to reduce the amount of rebellion. So in this next slide, we talk about resistance. A lot of people always say like, well, why didn't they revolt? Why didn't they resist? Well, there were plenty of instances of actual like attempts at rebellion and resistance. But small things, right? They slow their work down, they sabotage things. So they might like break tools, or I read a slave narrative at one point where there was, they would leave when things weren't kind of going right, and people were being abused in a way that they didn't really, beaten for things that they didn't agree with, whatever, that there would be matches that they would leave like on the barn, like, or like a fence post or something like that, to where they were kind of telling the overseer or the owner, like, all it takes is for us to do, strike of a match or whatever, in order to kind of destroy everything. But what they would do with like families, and why that was important, is as a parent, if you have children, the threat of your children being sold away as punishment, and it happened anyways. So it's not like that was a perfect system, but in some cases that would be used as kind of leverage. Like, you need to behave yourself, you need to stay in line, you need to do as you're told. Otherwise, I'll sell your children away. And the same thing for men. So single men were the the biggest runaway risks as well. And so that's why they wanted them to have family. You're less likely to maybe leave your family. Or and many of them did. Excuse me. And then maybe tried to come back for them later. But that was one of the other reasons why they tried to encourage families. So the Underground Railroad is probably one of the most famous. It's a network of safe houses that kind of connect throughout the South and then through the North to freedom. And then they would help those enslaved people once they got into a free state, in order to kind of set them up and help them with work and find a place to live. Harriet Tubman is probably one of the most famous. Last year, a wonderful movie came out titled Harriet, and it's very well done. It's a lot of historical accuracy. It does a really good job of kind of summarizing this period of time. She not only makes her way into freedom, but then she comes back in order to help family members and others into freedom. And she did so much. That's just one of the things that she did. Most escapees most escapes, what they would do is they would just try to find family members, or sometimes if they try to find their previous owner. That was one of the things that happened as well. Some stole forged paperwork to pass as free blacks, or as white. Some were able to pass off as white. Frederick Douglass escaped from Maryland. in 1838, and we'll talk more about him leading up to the Civil War. Denmark Vesey is an interesting one. So, interestingly enough, Denmark Vesey was a slave in Charleston. He had earned wages. So sometimes in cities, their owners would let them like on the side, or like in the evenings, or like on their day off, if they gave them a day off, because again, everyone was different. Some of them would let them work to earn wages. Now the wages are going to be, pennies, right? Imagine trying to save pennies to buy a car. Like that would be the equivalent of trying to buy your freedom. But Denmark Vesey earned wages on the side, and actually bought a lottery ticket and won the lottery, and then was able to purchase his freedom. And then he decided that he was going to seize city weapons and incite a slave rebellion. Now, someone sold him out. The plan was leaked, and he was executed. Nat Turner, similar or completely different situation. He was a slave, and he was actually educated. He was a preacher. And this is why you have a decline in educating slaves, and even like moving away from positions like this where they're teaching religion, because when you look at pretty much every rebellion or form of resistance that happens throughout kind of the American history of slavery, they were either a preacher or they had some sort of education. And so what he did is and it was a really nice, and a lot of preachers were, they were kind of the perfect example, because they would preach about exactly what the whites wanted them to preach about, how, slavery was good for them, and that, they would preach about certain biblical examples, throughout history about the slave and the master and being obedient, and like all of those things. But then on the other side of it, like they're organizing, resistance. And so it was a nice cover. Nat Turner was, if we want to consider it successful, he and his men, groups that they basically went from plantation to plantation in Virginia in 1831. And they killed 55 whites, women, children, babies in their crib. It was pretty violent, pretty bloody. It spread fear among whites among like no other. The film Harriet really kind of shows that a little bit as well. Just that resistance scared whites, but also how Northerners responded to it kind of led to that division. And what's important to know about every time there's a rebellion is that hands down, it is going to make things worse for slaves throughout the region. Every time there is a rebellion, conditions worsen, Black codes are strengthened throughout the South, okay? And that's important in kind of understanding why maybe there weren't more acts of rebellion. There were free African Americans in the South. In 1860, you had about 250,000 free Blacks. Some of them were emancipated from like the Revolution, and they continued to live in the South as a free Black. Some mulatto children, so mixed children, their fathers were white, and their mothers were slaves. Some of them were freed by their fathers. We've talked about Thomas Jefferson, for example. Others are going to purchase their freedom, like what we talked about with Denmark Vesey. Most free Blacks are going to live in cities so that they can have some sort of own property. You're not really going to have very many free Black farmers because it was so difficult to compete with those large plantations that are using enslaved labor. They are not equal to whites. They cannot vote. They are banned from working again in certain occupations. Kidnapping was extremely common. When we look at Solomon Northup in the film, or the memoir 12 Years a Slave, and that was made into a film, he was actually from upstate New York, but was in Maryland when he was, or in DC actually, when he was abducted. You had to keep your paperwork. It was by the time as you get closer to the Civil War as well, states are actually going to prevent free Blacks from living in Virginia, for example. They passed a law that you could not be a free Black, that you would be thrown into slavery, because it contradicted everything that they said. They were telling their enslaved slaves, that, you need us. Like, you can't do this on your own. However, if they saw a free Black in town working and living, with freedom, it was contradictory. And so they wanted to get that threat out. They didn't want any type of trouble or rebellion. White society is extremely complex, feudal almost. Rigid social hierarchy. You have the aristocracy, which are going to be, they're the elite. They are a small minority. They are wealthy planters. They own at least 100 slaves, 1,000 acres. They are going to maintain power by dominating those state legislatures. Remember that you can only run for office if you own a higher percentage of land. Now, that's going to start to change in some northern cities and northern states and western states. In the South, they maintain that all the way through up to the 1860s. And that's how they keep their power, is that they control the government. And when we talk about the power of the vote and democracy and democratization, the South was able to prevent that from happening. Where in the West and in the North, there was a major change. They like the old way. That's, more conservative. Like, that's kind of the view, is they wanted to keep the power at the top with the small elite. And they passed legislation that kept that supported, like economically supported them in a way where they were able to maintain that. There was not a ton of social mobility within the Southern states. Okay. Small farmers, they own slaves, less than 20. They are going to work several hundred acres or less. Majority of the cotton crop is coming from this group of people, because this is the majority. This is about 20%, I would say, of Southern farmers. And most of them, again, work in the fields with their slaves. They live modest lives, very similar to those living in the North. Poor whites, this is the vast majority. 3/4 of the population own no slaves at all. They couldn't afford the nice farmland, especially like in Mississippi and Alabama. So instead, they were subsistence farmers, which means it's just basically survival, like kind of self-sufficiency in order to feed their families. They were called, in a derogatory way, hillbillies or poor white trash by the wealthy planters. Again, though, they still supported the institution because they hoped that one day either themselves or their children could obtain enough land and purchase slaves and kind of live out that planter class, even though statistically it really wasn't possible. But that hope, right, that hope that they would one day be able to attain that type of wealth. They also liked the institution because there was someone always below them on that social ladder, right? Because of slavery, they weren't low man on the totem pole that, African Americans were, and slavery made that possible, because otherwise they could be seen as equals, which will play an important role in the future when you look at after emancipation and the division and the racism that existed because of that competition for superiority. Mountain people. Small number of farmers are going to live in the valleys of the Appalachian Mountains and the Ozarks. They disliked planters, and so we'll use Andrew Johnson as an example when we get to the Civil War. Many of them showed animosity towards those wealthy planters. They didn't like the institution of slavery. So kind of even like Hinton Helper, for example, where they were like, this hurts us economically. That doesn't mean that they believed in racial equality. They were still white supremacists. They just disliked the wealthy planters very much so. Not very many cities in the South at this point in time, but this was the location where farmers would trade. New Orleans was the only Southern city that was within the largest 15 cities of the time by 1860, but some cities were Atlanta, Charleston, Chattanooga, Richmond. They were considered large by Southern standards, but very small compared to a lot of those large northern cities. So as cotton becomes the basis of the Southern economy, it's going to shift from kind of this period of time in the 18th century where slavery was just defended as this economic institution to where it becomes a political and social issue of the 19th century. And white Southerners, start to get extremely defensive about the institution and how important it is, especially with Northerners. So it kind of started with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And they also get more defensive because in Europe, European countries are starting, like, so England and France are starting to abolish the institution. And so it's kind of fresh on people's minds, like, well, what are we going to do about American slavery? Keep in mind, though, that Northerners are still kind of profiting off of the cotton in their textile mills. But still, it becomes a defensive topic for sure, politically. Now, the code of chivalry is something, or Southern chivalry is kind of this Southern thought. It was dominated by wealthy planter class. Remember, it is a feudal system, if you really think about it, or a feudal society where you have like the wealthy aristocrats at the top, and then below them, kind of everyone else. So basically, if you were a gentleman, a Southern gentleman, they had this strong sense of personal honor. So dueling played a role in that. Defense of womanhood. And so that was something that they used to justify the institution of slavery. Like after the 13th Amendment, one of the things that they used a lot in order to keep African Americans as inferior with lynchings and black codes and Jim Crow laws, was that, that Black men, if they weren't enslaved, that they would go around and like raping their women. But I think the most important thing here is this paternalistic attitude toward anyone inferior than them. In particular, slaves, that it's their job to take care of them, that they know what's best for them, that they provide all these things for them. And that was kind of this justification. When we really talk about the Second Great Awakening and the religious component that plays into Southern religion, it'll make a little bit more sense in the coming chapters. The upper class do value education for their children. Either it be the education of the mothers. For example, like Salem College was one of the earliest institutions for higher education for women. A few different first ladies of this time period of the 19th century were educated at Salem College. That's how you attract another, of certain societal status. It's how you attract husbands so that you can then educate their sons, kind of that playing into the idea of Republican motherhood. But also the goal was for their sons to then go on to higher education after initially being like tutored either by someone that they paid for to come down and teach their children, or their wives, depending on their level of education. So the only acceptable professions for Southern gentlemen were either to continue the plantation and farming, the law, ministry, or military. And you'll see that among some of these Southern politicians and presidents of the 19th century. Now, in order to reduce slave revolts, lots of laws are being passed in the South that prevented African Americans from being educated. And the religious component as well, the slavery question is going to affect church membership. And we'll talk more about this with the Second Great Awakening, but it has to do a lot with biblical support. So where the Catholic and the Episcopalian churches kind of ignored it or even denounced the institution, such as the Unitarian Church, so declined sharply in the South. And even today, like, there are more Catholic churches and more kind of diversity, but for most of Southern history, I would say probably up until after World War II, it was predominantly Baptists, Methodists. You have your Lutherans and your Moravians and other little denominations like that. It was not very diverse because the Methodists and the Baptists kind of openly accepted the idea of slavery and kind of used and supported it in order to kind of maybe because most planters supported it, to kind of help make it a little bit more justified. And we'll talk more about that with the Second Great Awakening, but that was a part of their thought. Everything in society defended the economic institution of slavery. Now looking at the West. So when we think of the West and we think of the frontier, remember that it's ever changing. So in the 1700s or in the 1600s, it's along the Atlantic seaboard. By the 1700s, it's like the Appalachian Mountains. By the mid 1800s, it's now west of the Mississippi River. And a continuity in American history, at least up through the end of the 1800s, is the displacement of African Americans and the conflict over westward settlement. They have been trying to escape the expansion of Europeans and Americans since the very beginning. And again, we'll talk about all the way through the 1890s. By 1850, most natives lived west of the Mississippi River. By this point in time, they have either died out of at least those tribes have died out from disease or conflict, or maybe they've either left by force or they volunteered to move west of the Mississippi. The Plains Indians, which we'll talk about at a later period, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, they were nomadic. And part of the reason they became nomadic, well, one, you have the introduction of the horse by the Spanish way back when, so like part of the Columbian Exchange. But now they are mostly nomadic because it's easier to move as settlers come in. So they do follow the buffalo. That's another part of it. But the nomadic lifestyle is also easier as westward expansion happens. Please remember that this westward expansion plays into that nationalism that's kind of coming like during the era of good feelings in the 1920s, that sense of like that manifest destiny of taking this land and, the American dream and all of that. That has to be the negative effect. The consequence is on the Native American tribes. So although the location of the frontier is ever changing, this American concept of the frontier is the same. And we'll talk about that for a few more generations. But, the same American dream that motivated, those new immigrants that came over on the Mayflower, or the ones that came to Jamestown looking for a fresh start, it's the same thing for today. So either their thought of, if you've been around for generations, that your children have this ability to move west and obtain land, grow cotton, and own slaves for whites in the South, or new immigrants coming into large cities and moving into the frontier and owning land, something that could never have happened in Europe. That is a continuity. It promised greater freedoms for all ethnic groups, even American Indians, African Americans in the future, whether they be escaped slaves or after emancipation, eventually Asian Americans as well. It's going to create a lot of opportunities for people. So when we look at the frontier, there's a great book. They made a movie called The Revenant. This is what I think about when I think of the frontier and I think about the Rockies. These mountain men is what they were called, were early fur trappers and fishermen. They served as scouts and guides for people that eventually will seek out land in Oregon and California in the 1840s. We'll talk about that in later chapters. But life on the frontier was hard, and it was a lot like those very early colonists in the 1600s. They worked all day long. They lived in kind of these meager, they're isolated, but these small cabins or sod, which is like grass like stacked on top of each other, sod homes. Disease and malnutrition is going to kill more of them than Native American attacks. Pioneer women, they were the doctors, teachers. They did everything. They cooked, they took care of the home, but in addition to that, they helped their husbands. And so because of this, because of the isolation and because of the dangers of childbirth, it did result in a very short lifespan for frontier women. Environmental damage as well was important to think about with these westward frontiersmen. As they cleared land, they exhausted the soil after a few generations. Trappers and hunters are going to nearly take the beaver and the buffalo to extinction. So they're selling those pelts for a pretty decent profit, especially beaver pelts were like in high fashion in Europe during this time period, and they nearly did make that species extinct. So the West is pretty brief because we'll kind of talk more about that as more people seek out the West, but it's really important to kind of like summarize this sectionalism, this division between the North, the South, and the West in these years leading up to the Civil War. This chapter is really about summarizing what is going on socially and within society, and who's living in these different places, and how they value education and religion and economic institutions. And from this point on, in each chapter, we'll kind of be talking still about this antebellum period, but we'll be introducing more political conflicts that are going to divide the regions. But this chapter is extremely important. We will constantly be referencing back to this chapter leading up to the Civil War as what are the differences between Americans living in these regions, and how that's going to influence their political thought and how that's going to lead to civil war. Okay, so I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you next time.